Hello and welcome to The Magic in You. I am here today with Luke Eastwood, who began studying Druidry in 1995 in London, although he started life in Scotland. Luke moved to Ireland in 1999, was initiated into the Druid Clan of Dana in 2009, and completed his OBOD, so that's the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druid training in 2011. Luke has been involved in Druid groves in both County Westford and Kerry for many years, as well as organising spiritual events, and founded the Irish Druid Network website in 2006. He is currently the editor of the Pagan Ireland magazine, which began in 2021. A graduate of City University in London, Luke has worked for financial institutions and publishers in both London and Dublin. After dropping out, so to speak, and retraining in horticulture, Luke began his career as a part-time author, having published some 11 books to date. And he currently lives in West of Ireland. So I'm just going to bring you on, Luke, and say welcome to The Magic in You. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Francis, and thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
The pleasure's all mine, because if people have watched my podcast before, or my channel, whatever you call it these days, Luke is also the author of Scotia or Scotia, that I sort of talked about and then went down a lot of rabbit holes with the whole, what I saw was the concept behind the story, which we may or may not get to in our discussions, because at the moment, Luke, I just want to start off talking about you and what actually started your journey. Did you have any early influences and the like?
Yeah, um, yeah, that's an interesting question. One I often get asked, but it's sort of it's not a simple answer. Uh, I was a child of a Roman Catholic and an atheist, and uh, I had a very mixed messages growing up, and I did go to Catholic school. But it was sort of go to the school or go to the mass, but don't listen to the priest. Ignore everything. Or kind of so. I mean, I did become actually very religious, and I became a choir boy. No, an altar boy. Sorry, not a choir boy. Um, and I used to hate that because I was always worried I'd forget to ring the bell at the right time. I never did forget, but I always had this because I was sort of a bit of a daydreamer and I'd tend to drift off a bit. And I was always worried that I might sort of just be staring out the window at the right moment and, forget to ring the little bell. And that never happened. But I mean, I had even thought about becoming a priest because we had this vocation thing where a week of like visits from priests and nuns and whatever. And we watched all these films. And I remember I'd watched this film about St. Francis and St. Agnes, and it was like very inspirational because obviously he really got the idea of what Christianity was about. But unfortunately, I don't think the church has. But he, it seemed like great. I thought, well, maybe I might want to become a priest or something. But then, of course, celibacy is like a requirement. Interestingly, it's not in the Orthodox church. Had I been Orthodox, I might have actually become a priest because you can get married. But I thought, oh God, no girlfriend, no marriage, no sex ever in my whole life is rotten. No, no, forget it. Forget about that. So my interest in spirituality eventually moved in a different direction, which was, I suppose I kind of I wanted to find out about ancient Christianity, the roots of it, but that led me to paganism, which of course it would do, you know. But at the beginning of that, I was like, oh, this is a bit of a rabbit hole. Oh, this is weird. How come there's all this pagan stuff in Christianity? And then I just, in the end, just came to the conclusion that it was just another set of mythology that was like newer mythology than based on older mythology. And so, with time, I looked at loads of different religious paths. I've had a look at pretty much everything I could think of. And I kind of figured that I suppose I must say I'm really a pantheist. I picked something, you know. I know there's a, I say, okay, there's one creator in my opinion, and then there's a bunch of different avatars of this creator, which, it'd be what Jesus or whatever, you know, Bridget or Isis or, Apollo, whatever you feel like. And you just pick, I picked what suited me. And it just works for me. The sort of Celtic gods seem to be fitting with my worldview, and I suppose paganism sort of fits with this kind of eco ethos. I mean, back in the day with the original pagans, perhaps that wasn't a factor, but in the modern pagan movement, it's very much so sort of connection to the natural world, and that's very important to me. And you're actually living that life rather than just saying, "Oh, I love the earth," but actually doing something along the lines of actually trying to nurture the earth and the planet instead of just talking about it, which I am sad to say there's a lot of people in paganism who just say they love the earth, but they don't actually do anything to
Mm.
prove that they do.
Yeah, yeah. So you're one of these people who sort of like walk your talk as opposed to just talking your talk, or
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
I'm really a big believer in that. It's like it's very talk is cheap. That's a very good expression, I think. It's easy to say whatever you want, but actually backing it up with your actions is a different matter. And I think that's kind of important. And I mean, that's one of the problems I had with the Catholic Church is the hypocrisy and the corruption there. You've got these teachings of Jesus, but then you look at the actions over like, 2 millennia, or not, well, not quite that long, but more like 1700 years more or less, isn't it? Since Constantine, really.
Mm.
Um, that's sort of like the beginning of the modern church and the way they behave and what they talk about. There's this massive chasm between actual Christian sort of teachings and the dogma of the Catholic Church. And then you look at all the people that have been slaughtered all over the world in the name of Jesus. I mean, I don't think it'd be very proving if he was able to see what's actually been done in his name, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. Yes, certainly agree with you there, Luke. So how did you get involved in Druidry in particular? Because you've been initiated into the clan of Dana and also you've done OBOD training. So what sort of like drew you to Druidry?
Well, I was interested in all this Celtic mythology and I suppose it was a little bit of a part of my life growing up because I loved all the Arthurian stuff as a kid. And I remember watching this BBC TV series, which I'd love to see again. It seemed amazing at the time. That was in like the late 70s. I wonder if they'd ever re-show that or make it available to buy. And I had some books, some kids' books on, Breton and sort of Welsh stories and Scottish ones as well. And so that was very interesting. And then sort of later on, I discovered that actually we're still Druids because I kind of grew up thinking Druids was something that existed in the past. And a lot of history books of the time would be indicative that it's all gone. And we know very little about the Druids and what a pity and move on to the next subject kind of thing. And then I discovered actually that's not true. I think it was probably 1992 or 3. I read some magazine and had an interview with this guy called Rollo Morphling in it. And oh, he's an actual real druid who's alive today, based in down near Glastonbury. I think he is or was the head of the Glastonbury Order of Druids. So he probably still is. He's pretty ancient by now. Anyway, so that was interesting. And then I well, I'm going to look into this more, and I started reading a lot of history books about, Avebury and, um, the Callanish stones and, Stonehenge, blah blah, and sort of reading some of the myths like the Mabinogion and whatever. And then, I had difficulty finding anything in real terms, and I discovered this book by accident. I was on my way to work in London. I looked in a shop window. It was a bookshop in Swiss Cottage, and there was this book called the Book of Druidry. And I thought, oh my God, I'd come back at lunchtime and get that because the shop wasn't open. It was too early. So I rushed back at lunchtime and went in and bought it. It was the only copy which was in the window. So I lapped that up, and that was like the first real decent book because I had like found lots of books on magic, on hermeticism, you know, spell books and grimoires, and the Greater and Lesser Keys of Solomon, all that. But that wasn't really where I wanted to go. And I studied some Kabbalah, and again, it wasn't quite where I wanted to go. And then Wicca as well. Again, not really quite, close but no cigar kind of thing. And then yeah, that really was, yes, this is it. I hit the jackpot. This is it. Bingo, I have it. And but it wasn't actually till I moved to Ireland that I actually joined an order. Um, I had a Druid wedding down in Avebury when my now ex-wife actually, but yeah, that was pretty good. It was quite inspirational. And then I got involved in ecos of activism at about 18, 19 when I used to do what they use in conservation before it was called ecology, and volunteering to like clear rhododendrons out of this park because all the native species were really suffering from that. And then later I knew someone involved in Greenpeace, so I got involved in that, and actions in London, and the McLibel going around stickering these anti-McDonald's stickers all over London and things. And um, you know, I think I did some really naughty things actually. There was this Shelter Sea campaign. I did some questionable things there. I can't probably say what they were because they might involve well, it's retrospectively, it's a long time ago, but yeah, let's say that they probably weren't 100% legal, some of the things that I got involved with in the activism.
But you
Um,
found your way to Druidism and this sort of this
yeah.
underpinning element with nature and
Mm,
connecting with nature. And this has sort of led
yeah.
on to some of your writing as well. So let's talk about some of your writing because you've written some 11 books to
Yeah.
date. And what was your first book and what inspired you to write it?
Okay. Well, the first book I actually wrote was called The Journey, although that was published after the first one. I I had joined, I think, OBOD in 2003 or four, I forget exactly. And while I was doing that, I'd already read a lot of material. I'd started buying source material, um, reproductions of old books, compilations such as like John Matthews produced a book of three different books on, bardism and shaman and druid. I think they were called source books, the three source books, and various other bits and pieces. You know, obviously, I discovered a lot of the what was current with Druidism was very much Welsh centered, like Bardas and things like that, and the poems of Taliesin and things. So I bought all those things, but then I discovered there's this huge like library, if you want, which is immensely large in comparison to the Welsh material from Ireland. And to a lesser extent, there's a lot of Scottish material which has also been just glossed over. And I suppose it's very sort of Anglo-centric, early romantic revival Druidry just completely ignored Ireland, even though one of the primary people in that was actually John Toland in 1717. He's supposed to have started the first Druid order with some other guys, and they had this big meeting. He was actually from, I think, from Donegal, and he was an Irish speaker, but because he was Catholic, I think he had to go to Europe to be educated. So he went to Europe and got a degree and everything, and I think he converted to Protestantism actually, and then moved to London and became like this real big guy. He was a massive philosopher, an educator, and a political force in his time, although he's largely forgotten now. But he is an Irishman. but he's sort of written out of Druidic history to a large extent, outside of Ireland he is anyway. I've got his book, his history of Druidism. Um, but I realized he wasn't the only person or the only book. I mean, there's all these annals, and there's particularly the Book of the Taking of Ireland, which is one like the oldest histories in Europe, never mind the British Isles or and Ireland. It's, we're talking, it's obviously not actually chronological in the sense of you've got dates written down like Egyptian history would have actual dates that you can tie to the modern calendar, but you're talking about events that happened like possibly 4,000 years ago or even longer. The earliest invasions, the first populations to migrate to Ireland. These 7 or 8 migrations have happened, and then into the modern era, you get obviously the Vikings and Normans. But this was all new to me up until around, I suppose, around the end of the century, about 2000-ish onwards. I started reading all this stuff, and I was like, oh my God, why isn't this in any of the Druid books? It should be. And then I started reading Irish authors like Dahi O'Hogan and people like that, uh, and Fergus Kelly, and they were actually discussing all this stuff. But that wasn't getting into the mainstream. It was all very academic. And I thought, well, you know what? I accumulated quite a big library of books, and I'm like, God, it's such a pain in the ass having to have like I got like 200 books here, and I'm like looking this and this one. I thought, God, wouldn't it be great to have like a book which was like a concise of like compendium of some of the stuff that I could actually use myself. I thought, well, because I had to do a project for, I think, for OBOD. I think it's the Elvet grade. You have to do some kind of a thing. So I did the whole thing on Ohm. I thought, well, maybe I could just write a book and actually condense a lot of the stuff down into a more usable format instead of having to like have this big, huge shelf. Actually, you can't see it on camera, but I've got a massive overflowing bookcase here with most of my esoteric books here. Um, but I mean, that's a hell of a lot of books and a long time collecting them, like, probably, well, at least, yeah, 30 years worth of buying books. And I mean, some of them cost a fortune as well. Like, I've been generally lucky in getting secondhand stuff a lot of the time or getting reprints. To get like original copies of some books, you're looking at crazy money, like, 300, 500 euros even, for one book. It could be insane. So, one of the things about the digital age is like all these reproductions of ancient books is fantastic because, you pick them up for 20 euros or $20 instead of having to pay like, hundreds for them. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to try and write this book. And then out the blue, this guy from the UK called, Trevor Greenfield from Moon Books, he just emailed me because I'd already set up Irish Druid Network at this point, and was running that website. And he said, "Oh, do you know anyone writing a book?" And I said, "Well, actually, as it happens, I'm already doing that." So that led to that book. And then the book that came out after, it's not really a pagan book, called The Journey. It's more sort of like I don't know, a sort of compilation of spiritual musings and ideas. I wouldn't say it was exactly channeled as such, but I'd just be sitting on a train or on a bus or, in a park, and I just suddenly these things would come into my head, and I'd write them down on a packet of cigarettes because I smoked then, or, on a scrap of paper or inside a notebook or anywhere I could think of. And then over time it built up, and then I kept running into these quotes that seemed to like run, fit very well with what I was thinking. And then I thought, oh, this is interesting how there's a synchronicity between like I'd open a book and there'd be a quote and I'd go, that's like I wrote something about that 2 days ago. So I started making a note of these quotations, and that eventually led to this book called The Journey. was a bit of a strange period in my life, because I was sort of very, I suppose, going through sort of a lot of changes and sort of spiritual development at that time. And part of that seemed to be this sort of weird process of sort of just sort of um, things sort of dropping into my head, you know. I often find with spirit guides or whatever, that's often very much the way they communicate with me. It's like I got a letterbox in the back of my head, and this letter drops in, and things that just appear as if from nowhere that are things I'm not thinking about, not interested in. It's like they're just dropped into my subconscious, and I've learned to tell over time, where I think, something's coming from an external source rather than it just my own thoughts.
And all this is sort of influenced and sort of been woven through your writing as well. So it's
Mm.
almost sounding like the path of the Druid, especially for you, is more than just something that you, I don't know, put on the white robes on a Sunday and run off to the local stone circle or something. It's more of a lifestyle that sort of embraces everything that you do, rather than
Yeah.
just an external sort of practice as well.
Oh, very much so. And like when you say, I do have a set of white robes, but I very, very rarely wear them. I would say probably in my whole Druid career, I've probably worn robes sort of like probably, I would say I'd be struggle to think if I've worn them 10 times in all those years. I only
Mhm.
wear them for things like weddings and special occasions. Maybe it's a bit more than 10, but you know what? It's still a very small number. It wouldn't have made it to out of double figures, you know, because it's
Mhm.
not important to me.
Yeah.
To me, the practice it's all about the practice and actually, as you say, living it as a lifestyle, as it being part of my life. And the accoutrement, I think they're irrelevant. You don't need a massive drum or a staff or a big set of robes or a big cloak or a bunch of mega crystals to stick on the end of your staff. That's all completely irrelevant.
Mm.
Somebody a long time ago, there was actually a lady who I did some work with, a Wiccan up in Dublin, a lady called Barbara Lee, and she was asking us as part of this sort of course on magic I participated in, oh, what's the most important thing? And people go, oh, it's an athamia or it's a wand, it's this, it's that, blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, it's you, isn't it? And she says, yeah, that's spot on. None of
Mm.
this shit really actually matters. It's nice to have. It can be a tool. It can be useful. It can help you focus. Like a wand is like, like an amplifier, if you like. But I mean, if you don't generate the magic yourself, the wand is useless, isn't it? It's like
Mm.
it's only as good as the person using the tool. So
Mm.
I just thought, well, do I actually even need the tools at all? I thought as I got better at things, so no, just get rid of them all. You don't need any of these things. A finger is just as good as a wand, or you know, if you really, you really practice, your mind is good enough. You don't need anything. You just
Yeah.
so I thought, well, I think it's a red herring for people who are starting, they think they've got to have all this gear, and that's really important. But I think that's actually leading people down a cul-de-sac that they don't need to go down to tell them that you need to buy all 50 statues of the goddess, and or you've got to have like this huge drum. And if you don't have like a special deerskin drum that's this size, then you're not going to be a proper practitioner.
Mm.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I've got a drum. I also do have some statues as it happens, but
Mm.
they're not they're yeah, but they're not key to
Yeah.
my practice. They're
Mm.
nice things to have, but they're totally non-essential as far as I'm concerned.
Mm. And
Um,
and also what you're saying earlier about, say, your reference, your connection with nature. It's sort of, I mean, and I'm just thinking this is sort of a hill that I'm on, and we live in a very sort of capitalistic
mm,
consumeristic world, and the more external stuff that we have, to me, is more of a distraction to take away from which and I'm assuming that Druidry is the same as the path that I follow, which
Mm.
is all about self-discovery. But instead
Yeah,
of looking out there, we've got to like come back. And then when you put um so the environment aspect to it as well, when we just keep wanting more external stuff, that's usually is at the detriment to nature as a whole, because we need those resources to make all this external stuff. Where, as you said, we can we don't need it if we just can go internally and open
yeah,
up.
I totally agree with you 100%. I mean, I'm well aware. I've known people that own shops or manage shops, and they're getting all this resin-based stuff coming from China that's mass produced, and I'm like, yeah. And I like to use found stuff or make things myself. And like you were saying about going inward, I think it's almost a contradiction that by going out into nature, into the outside world, of sitting next to a tree or by a stream, that's actually helps you to go inward by going outside. So it's almost like a contradiction, really, isn't it? That by going out into the actual physical real world, it for me certainly it's helpful in
Mm,
actually going into inward into myself and in a journey
mm,
through nature that I connect to my inner self or to my higher self or to the Godhead or the Creator or whatever you want to call it. Um, and I think for me, it's really important to actually live by these principles. When I say I actually care about the earth, then that means I have to do it. I can't just, say that and then go off and jump into my Ferrari and drive down to McDonald's and order 18 burgers. It's just, that doesn't make any sense to me. I think you have to have
mm,
obviously everyone has to compromise to some extent. I have a part-time job. I go to my job and I have a car. I'm not living in a mod hut or something. But within the parameters of the life that the system that we live in, broken as it is, that I try to minimize my impact. I
mm,
live in an off-grid house. We've got windmill and solar power and batteries and stuff. I mean, I'm like pretty much a non-consumer. I mean, I wait till my clothes are like worn out, and then I sew up my socks and use them again. And then when they're
mm.
really gone, I throw them away and buy some more. But I've met people they wear things two or three times and they just buy something else. And I'm like, I actually have a coat that I've had since I was 25 years old. I got it repaired recently, and it's perfectly good. And it's like it'll probably last me till I'm 100 if I live that long. And just like, why? It isn't, you know, this whole consumerist society seems in opposition to my interpretation of what Druidism is about, you
Mm.
know?
No, I definitely agree with you. And I think too, the more is saying, well, to go externally, to go internally, I think it's also we're in this mindset, and that's something that's I think has been happening for millennia, that we are disconnected, that we're not part of nature. Yet when we go into nature, we're reminded that we are part of nature. We're not separate from it at all. And we
Mm,
need nature. And we've got a concept here in Australia called Dunderi. It's actually an Aboriginal term from the Daly River, which is in the Northern Territory, which basically means deep listening. And it's something that, from my understanding, you've got a similar concept in a lot of Indigenous teachings all around the world, where we go
mm,
into nature to listen. And by listening to nature, like really listening, we then can tap into our own self as well, which could be our,
mm.
as you said, our own Godhead, opening up that letterbox at the bottom back of our heads, and then tuning back in and understanding our, as you said, our footprint, our connection on a deeper level. And to me, that is spirituality, regardless of how you want to describe it as.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've read a lot of things. I spent some time in Australia, not very long, about a month, but I did get a deep sense of the connection to the earth. I've I didn't actually meet any Native Americans in America when I was there working for about 6 months, but I've read some of the mythology, and I've since actually in Ireland met a couple of Native American people who live here. And yeah, and then again with like Taoism in China, and look at, there's a lot of parallels with ancient Druidism and these belief systems, because I think they're kind of plugged into nature in a way that some of the later, especially the Abrahamic religions don't seem to be. They're a lot more sort of transcendental, whereas I think is sort of, you access your spiritualities of the Godhead, if you like, through nature, rather than it being nature being this corrupted thing, and the gods are up there, and that's where the perfection is, and down here is all crap, and something to not worry about, because ultimately you're going off somewhere else and the earth isn't important. I think I'm very much an animist, and I think, you know, um, well, even in Christianity, there are references to that thing. Like, I think it's the Gospel of Thomas. It says, the kingdom of God is spread out all across the earth and people don't see it. I mean, that alludes to that same way of thinking, and that, God is everywhere, spirit is everywhere. There's spirit in everything that exists. So, do we actually need to like leave this place to go and find like spiritual succor, or is it just a matter of actually connecting? I think
Mm.
it's actually, if you can learn to connect and actually really be sort of in, I suppose you need to find a liminal space in which to actually transcend the everyday mundane reality of, oh, I got to buy more toothpaste, or did I pay that bill, and what am I going to have for tea tonight? You get out of that through some kind of liminal space, like either meditating, or, in the Irish tradition, you've got these three realms. So sometimes where the three realms meet, like on a beach or something, is a perfect place to do that. And you get into a quiet sort of frame of mind, and then you can actually move into a spiritual realm, and then you feel this connectedness that you can't feel when you're stressed and when you're thinking about modern life. Because I mean, we're all full of clutter. Our brains, if you live in the Western modern world, just by default, your brain, if you're interacting with computers and the TV and blah blah, all that stuff, your brain's going to be full of clutter, because you're just bombarded with
Mm.
streams of information constantly. So, I mean, how can you be spiritually tuned in when you're just being hit with all this stuff all the time? You really can't. It's almost impossible, I'd say. You have to tune out of it first.
Come to a unique balancing act, I think. Sort of,
Mm.
but it's not sort of like using one in the absence or another, or instead of the other. It's like bringing the both to we because we still have to sort of integrate in this modern world, regardless of our opinions of it, to a certain extent
Yeah.
anyway. But it's like
Mm.
sort of like bringing in sort of our spiritual beliefs or our spiritual teachings, or finding that grounding through nature into helping us to sort, or even as we were talking a bit earlier, having a little bit more conscious awareness of what we consume
Yeah.
and thinking of it. We are unfortunately running out of time, Luke, but I do have a couple more questions that I would like to ask you.
Go ahead. I'll
First,
try to be a bit quicker in replying.
oh, that's all right. Um, do you have anything that you know now that you wish you knew or had an understanding of right back in the 90s, when you were first sort of like beginning your spiritual discoveries?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One really would be like that I realize it doesn't matter what kind of spiritual path you pick, there's always a certain level of hypocrisy and cynicism that you'll find there. And I had tremendous respect for people, I thought, oh my gosh. And then you realize a lot of these people actually have feet of clay. And, we really shouldn't put people on pedestals, or this of guru worship, life coach, spiritual leaders, and all that. And I mean, when you look behind the curtain, you see so many of them are actually quite corrupt, or they're, they say one thing and they're not really genuine. They're terrible hypocrites, some of them. And I think, I would say I wish I'd understood that sooner. I wasted a lot of time looking for teachers that couldn't teach me. I did find one or two people that were a tremendous influence and positive, but on the whole, I'd say most, people, largely it's the blind leading the blind, and really you should probably take a Gnostic approach towards your own spirituality, and try and find your own answers, and not look for someone else to give you those answers. I wish I'd known that a lot sooner, because there's people go around looking for gurus, and they switch gurus, and they do nothing but go from one guru to another, and then they're none the better for it, and they still don't understand why they're here and what life is about. No, obviously not everyone, of course, but there are people like that. And I think when you're young, you tend to be that way because you just assume that older people have got the answers, but that's not necessarily the case. It's more, I think you've got to look for sort of genuine and a certain sort of naivety almost, instead of cynicism in people. If you can see that, then I think you've some chance. If people are totally cynical, you're probably going to get nothing out of them in terms of trying to find an understanding for yourself, you know?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Yes, yes. And another question, or and we sort of like touched on it very briefly. And this is for the people who may have seen my other video when I sort of like shared some of my thoughts on Scotia, which I'm going to have to reread. Um, and this sort of ties in what you said earlier about one of the sort of books that you sort of read that brought you into Druidry, which was The Taking of Ireland. And to me, when I was reading your book, I was going down rabbit holes in relation to, say, books like The Taking of Ireland that I actually mentioned. And it's a concept that I call mythic histories, because it goes back, I suppose, the history of, as you said, the first races or population of various parts of the world before writing actually was established. So it's all contained within our stories and our mythology. And in Scotia, when you sort of also blended in or sort of weave together different threads from different stories around the Egyptian myths that you sort of all sort of woven in together. To me, that sort of highlighted the importance of the mythic histories. It's like they're not just stories, they're more than just stories. There is fact in those stories because this is how they were told. So I suppose what I'm sort of asking, because you did a lot of research with Scotia, um, how important then are our mythologies, our sacred stories, when we're looking back and trying to determine the past, as opposed to moving into sort of academic texts, which can only, well, really, so in particular, say Ireland, the books that we've got, a lot of them were written by the invaders. So where it comes to the what we call the mythic stories, the mythic histories, how important are they?
Well, I think they're very important, but you've got to bear in mind, I mean, even now, you think about someone write a history of, we'll say for an example, the Vietnam War. You could read 10 different books on that, and they're going to give you different, someone who's Vietnamese and someone who's American have both written a book. They're going to give you a very different version. And even then, it's sort of like you get a lot of dry history, and it's, oh, this happened in this date and this battle and this and whatever. Often with a lot of sort of academic history, you lose the personal voice, you lose sort of the actual sense of the culture where it's coming from. Whereas a lot of oral history tends to be transmitted by the people themselves who lived in whatever land it happens to be, and their voice is going to be of the conquered perhaps, or the in the cases of Ireland, you've got a whole bunch of conquests, and that was written down by monks, but so it seems. But they would have received those stories. They would have been Irish speakers. They would have been old Irish at the beginning of that time in the fifth and sixth centuries. And many of them may have actually formerly been, pagans anyway. So that process of writing down stories. So it's probably just in that particular book, the books were taking on you three different versions. So there might be three oral versions that got captured at one point, and they've been written down, and then they're preserved forever. But I mean, all of these, if you even look at the, any text, the Egyptian texts, they were a version written down by somebody onto the wall of a temple or whatever. But you've basically just got one account. But with oral history, there's still like multiple different versions of, the Tana and things like that. And they've just, in some cases, have been passed down, generation and generation since, they don't know when. It's been a particular family. There was a guy in Tralee, which is in County Kerry, used to tell an oral version of, the cattle raid of Cooley, Tambo Cooley. But anyway, he'd been doing that, and he's dead now. And he'd go into the pub and tell that story for like an hour or so or whatever, and get a few pints. And his dad had been doing that before, and who knows, maybe his granddad and his great 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 granddad, or grandmother or whatever, had been doing that for. And in the end, people, they don't actually remember where the stories came from exactly because it's been there for so long. But there's a continuity, and that
Mm.
it's of a cultural phenomenon. It's part of the, part of the identity of a nation, really, that these stories are preserved and carried forward. And of course, there's probably embellishments and slight changes, but I don't really believe that ancient peoples or indigenous peoples just make up stories as fiction,
Mm.
and say, right, I'm just going to make up a story about, uh, you know, uh, Bob the Builder, or what's that pig? I can't remember the
Peppa,
name of
Peppa,
him.
Peppa Pig.
Pepper the pig, and turn it into mythology. People didn't think like that.
Mm.
These were real events
Yeah.
that were important enough for people to record and memorize these stories. So they weren't, I think, it's been a trivialization of mythology to some extent, that people
Mm.
just think, oh, it's just a bunch of stories. But, you know, before we had writing, this was the vital source of your your personal, your families, your tribes, your nation's history. That was the only way it could be transmitted, was orally. So, I think it was actually really important. And perhaps because writing's everywhere, it now seems less important. But
Mm.
I think it's still an important part of cultural identity.
Yes, and it sort of ties in, with your studies in Druidry, because that's the role of the bard, was the storyteller, or the he was the one who recited the genealogy of the kings and of the families, and he had to know all that as he traveled amongst the land as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So
yeah, I suppose.
we
Uh,
are we are unfortunately running out of time. So I'd just like to end with, what advice would you offer the seeker? If someone came to you wanting to learn about Druidry, where would they start? What advice could you give them?
Well, I think it's a bit easier these days in terms of trying to find source material, but I would say, look at the old books mostly first. I would say anything written probably prior to about 1990, you're more safe with. Certainly I think the medieval and Victorian texts are really worth looking at. And then as far as actually studying and learning, I think follow your intuition is a really important thing. And like if you can find a great teacher, brilliant. But I think experience is as important as knowledge. And I think part of actually getting out into the natural world as part of your process of learning is absolutely essential. You don't want to be the sort of druid stuck in an ivory tower in a library. I think you have to immerse yourself in nature to really actually understand it. I don't think you'll ever really follow it properly. It's like if you just looked at 1,000 pictures of the sun and never saw a sunrise or a sunset in real life, you're never going to appreciate it for what it truly is. And I think spirituality is like that. It should be immersive for you to really understand it. But I think above all, intuition. If you meet people and you think, oh, this person's great, or this person might be a bit funny, that the smiles there, and the words, but if you don't feel things are right, then you probably should listen to those instincts. I think when you're young, it's often easy to dismiss instinct and think, oh, I must be imagining this. But in my experience, often those kind of vibes you pick up about things, certainly in regard to spirituality, are really important signposts that you should take note of.
No, fantastic advice. And if people want to reach out and learn a little bit more about you and your books, where can they go?
Well, you can get stuff from the usual outlets, who the big sellers, but I've also got a website which is lukeeastwood.com,
Yes, I'll put
and
the links below. I'll
I've
put
got
the
a
links.
YouTube. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put all the links below, including your YouTube channel. And Luke, thank you very much for your time today and talking about the magic in you. It has been a delight, and I've learned a lot
Right.
more about Druidry than what I knew before. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're more than welcome.